Good afternoon. While we're getting the presentation up here this afternoon, I want to thank you for having me here today. I want to start, before I get into what I want to show you today, just talk a little bit about IRI, what we do, what I do. We spend a lot of time, especially on our research side, thinking about how we can look at the issues that are facing consumers as they are either struggling with issues in retirement or preparing for retirement. We do a lot of work on studying what they think about how ready they are, how prepared they are for retirement. We find, for example, when we go out and talk to the boomer generation, that fully 75% of the folks that we talk to have some level of trepidation about how they're going to experience their retirement, about how ready they are for their retirement. And so on the research side, what we try to do is produce content, produce research for not only consumers but also for advisors to help them understand how insured retirement solutions can help them improve outcomes. So what I want to walk through today are some scenarios, basically, where income can be created in a couple of different ways and how those scenarios might play out, especially in light of healthcare costs, of what retirees going forward from here might face in terms of healthcare. So the broad themes that we'll talk about, of course, the impact of longevity on those healthcare costs. What does it mean to be in relatively good health or excellent health versus what it means to be in a lower state of health and poor health? And how does that impact what your income needs are going to be in retirement? What do these portfolio and kind of think about an income portfolio, which is a very different way, actually, for me to look at this, and I think for a lot of people, to look at constructing a portfolio of investments, be that including annuities or not. I spent 10 years at Morningstar before I joined IRI a year ago, and I spent a lot of time looking at variable annuities, looking at different investment products and deconstructing those products to build tools for advisors to be able to compare and contrast them. Never really connecting that to the consumer and what the consumer was experiencing. So the past year has been quite an experience for me to start thinking about things in more of those terms and more of those consumer need terms. So we'll look at that, and we'll look at what the different options are that folks have, that near retirees and retirees have for constructing those portfolios. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the behavioral issues and some of the macro issues that can actually really derail what might look on paper to be a pretty good plan to start out with. And so we'll talk about those issues in the context of retirement, in the context of healthcare issues and expense issues, and what might very well be bad timing. And then at the very end, I'm going to take a couple more daring shots, and I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not an actuary, but I've got some ideas. So I'll see how much I can get torn apart by any actuaries in the room on that. That'll be a little fun we can all have together. So here's some things, as we go through the rest, these are just some things I'd like you to kind of keep in the back of your mind that sort of form the backdrop for what I'm going to talk about. One is life expectancy. I think when you see things like, the one that jumps out here the most to me is that if you have a couple age 65, you have a 50% chance that one member of that couple is going to reach age 93. To me, that's just extraordinary. It's just not it's not a possibility that you can ignore, perhaps the way that it was ignored 30 years ago, or not thought about. Ignored might not be the right word. And then a 1 in 4 chance that one of those folks, one member of that couple is going to reach age 95. That's potentially setting up a scenario where someone could spend almost as much time in retirement as they did working. Or as much time in retirement as they did working. So how do you spend and how do you control for expenses and how do you create income that's going to last as long as you worked? That's a daunting challenge, and that's, I think, feeds right back into why when we go out and talk to whoever we talk to, I mentioned boomers, it doesn't change when you talk to millennials. None of them feel like they have really any degree of confidence in their retirement, barring being part of the 1% or having a significant inheritance that they can rely on, or they might be confident because they just don't think about it at all. Then there's the concept of health expectancy. So we have life expectancy and we have health expectancy. And some of the things I'm going to talk about are I think, very pertinent to this discussion of what your life is going to look like in terms of the last few years, and what could that potentially mean in terms of the expenses that you might face from a healthcare perspective, and the income that you have to think about sustaining as you get to those years. So if we look at health expectancy, you have just on average, and this is actually going back and incorporating, this isn't, using probabilities, one of a couple, or this is just plain, 65 years old, average life expectancy is 84, but average health expectancy is several years earlier. So, that's really setting up this situation where you have you have to think about what things are going to be like in the last 5 or 6 years. You have to make sure that you have income to cover that. And then the third thing is on the return side, on what your expected return is going to be. In any scenario, any illustration or plan or what have you that is created to produce income is going to have assumptions. By necessity, you don't just say, well, here's $1 million or here's $500,000 and spend this, and you say it's going to earn something, and you think about that, and I have a little story to share at the end here that I think is pertinent to that. But you're typically going to make an assumption, and I've seen a lot of these done, and I've seen them done, at 5%, 6%. Years ago, I remember seeing these done at 12%. Can't believe that even existed, but I remember that in the 90s, 12%. That seems mind-boggling right now that you would do that. But 7 or 8, you can see 7 or 8% used as an assumption on what the return will be. But if we look at, and is anyone not familiar with the concept of investor returns versus total returns? So that's probably something you've all heard before, but I'll just very simply, total return would be the return that a portfolio of investments achieves over any given period of time based solely on the return of the underlying securities of that portfolio, right? Investor returns, that's when you actually look at the impact of cash flows. So you look at when cash came in and out in the aggregate, right? So if you're looking at a balanced fund, you're looking at all assets in that fund, and you're looking at the cash flows in and out of that fund over a period of time. So when Dalbar looked at that and looked at those annualized investor returns from the period 1984 through 2013, this is a balanced portfolio. This is what a lot of people would do, either planning for retirement in those pre-retirement years or actually in retirement, 60-40, right, bond equity portfolio, 1.9%, less than 2%. It's an annualized compound rate of return. That's not very encouraging, and that doesn't sound a whole lot like what you hear in terms of a long-term return for a balanced portfolio. But it's basically the buy high, sell low, so that's what's happening out in the real world. That's, people are hitting a 2008 type period and having a significant loss, and rather than doubling down, which in the rearview mirror can seem like a good strategy, there's capitulation that occurs. There's the running to cash. And then there's potentially the missing out of the solid returns that happen post those periods. And so all of that is coming in to produce that 1.9% return over that period of time. So those are 3 things. Just sort of keep those in the back of your mind as we move forward. So now what I want to talk about is actual healthcare expenses. And these are, this data is actually coming from HealthView Services. And if you're not familiar with HealthView Services, they do a lot of work on pulling data from actual health claims. They look at over 50 million claims per year to develop these cost estimates. And what these are doing is, this is actually projecting out and saying, this is not any one individual, obviously. This is in the aggregate. This is on an average basis. What might someone in poor health, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment, someone in poor health versus someone in excellent health, what might they be looking at in terms of total expenses over their lifetimes? And this is nominal, so this is going to be in future dollars. Now, these are going to differ across income ranges, and that's primarily due to means testing, because these cost estimates, this is incorporating premiums, this is incorporating actual out-of-pocket expenses and expenses for supplemental health insurance as well. But if you're in the, and we'll deal for the rest of what I'll talk to you about today, we'll deal with that kind of middle income range. But your costs can range to, a low of 200,000 to a high of almost 450,000 over the course of your retirement, based on that actual claims data that was pulled. And these are significantly higher than a lot of other estimates that I've seen. I've certainly seen, other estimates from other sources, and they tend to not look great either. Any estimates that you see of what healthcare costs could potentially be in retirement are typically larger than people think they would be. But these are particularly large, and interestingly, they come from that actual data. So they come from those actual claims and that's being pulled from what people are actually paying. And, of course, from standard data such as Medicare premiums and, as I mentioned, the means testing. So we'll look at how that folds in to the creation of an income portfolio. And so what do I mean, when I showed you that? I want to show you what, kind of bracketing this and looking at two ends of the spectrum between excellent health and poor health. It's just some basic, really, readings, and, so on the excellent health side is someone eats well, exercises, has normal readings, has good family history, doesn't use tobacco, doesn't have, family history of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, things like that. Whereas someone in poor health doesn't have any of that good stuff going. So these are like less than positive, health readings like blood pressure and cholesterol, poor family history, tobacco use, and all that. So obviously, most people will fall somewhere in between these two extremes. But importantly, I think, good planning and thinking about what those expenses could potentially do to you in retirement, to your income, you need to know where you are on this. And I think it's important to make sure you understand what the implications of this are for your retirement years. So when we look at that on an annual versus a cumulative basis, this is pretty intuitive. It's about what you would expect, is that somebody in poor health is going to have higher annual expenses. They'll be going to see the doctor more. They'll potentially have treatments and prescription drugs, things like that they'll need to have and use, versus the cumulative for the healthy person is going to be higher. And there are two reasons that cumulative is higher, which are interesting. One is pretty obvious. You live longer, you're going to pay more, right? So it's pretty simple math there. The other is that you also raise probabilities as you age. You raise probabilities that you're going to be dealing with conditions that are more typically associated with those advanced ages. So things like, dementia is a good example. So you're going to have these types of things and all of that is going in the mix, and all of that is coming into this estimate of what these costs are going to look like. And so when we start thinking about those costs and thinking about that in terms of generating income, and that's when things start to get interesting, because that's when you have to start looking at things like the cumulative spending that will need to be done to generate income that you're going to need for your basic expenses and whatever other goals and aspirations you have for retirement. And then you're going to layer on top of that these healthcare expenses that you could be facing. So this is just showing what happens to an investment portfolio over time as that cumulative spending goes up. So there's no trick to any of this. It's as you spend and your portfolio decreases and that cumulative spending goes up, you're going to get to a point where that portfolio will be depleted. Now, that happens to be at age 87. This is using 3% average annualized rate of returns. This is just assuming that you're spending to meet those basic needs expenses, you're spending to meet those health care expenses, and your portfolio is dropping. But it's done at 3% because I could have done it at 1.9%, and this would look far worse. Right? But 3%, at least historically, the 1.9% is coming from that behavioral aspect of being in a balanced fund coming in and out. So I don't think it's unrealistic to expect 3% if you're being far more conservative and you kind of stick to the plan. You're not going to get 3% out of a money market, not now. But it seemed a little bit more toward thinking about somebody who just didn't want to take any risk or wanted to take very little risk, that they should be able to achieve that 3%. But it still runs out And I'm carrying that 3% all the way out till age 87. What does somebody do, and this is coming back to the behavioral aspect, what happens when you're 82 and 83 and you're still in good health and you're still seeing your expenses rise and you're seeing that portfolio drop? Are you going to take any risk at all? And that's where I think it gets very, very difficult for that systematic withdrawal portfolio that doesn't incorporate anything that's guaranteed to be sustainable. So I'm sorry for all these numbers. But there is a method to this, and there is something, and I don't need to go through every one of these. I just wanted to show you on kind of a comparison basis what things might look like for someone who is faced with these healthcare expenses, who has some base needs, and who has income sources such as Social Security, and has a portfolio when they go into retirement. So here's two ways that they can deal with that, right? One is you can just withdraw systematically from your portfolio over time. And again, this is using that 3% annualized rate of return. Or you can incorporate an insured solution. And the way I did this was to assume that there would be one purchase of an immediate annuity at age 65 and another at age 75. So why not buy it all up front? Well, I think it makes sense to think about how your health might change. When you're 65 versus when you're 75, a lot can change in that 10-year period. So maybe that second annuity purchase never happens. That might not be a smart thing to do at 75, depending on what your health status looks like and what your needs are. It also is going to produce a higher income payment at age 75 because the mortality credits will be higher. Potentially, interest rates could be more attractive at that point. No guarantee of that, of course, but when you ladder the annuities in this fashion, you can get to the same place. You're just going to be a little bit more heavily dependent on withdrawals to meet those income needs. But then when you get to age 75 and you say, well, I'm still in very, very good health, so this additional purchase makes sense for me, then you alleviate that withdrawal pressure from that portfolio. So you're going from 32,000, and then 5 years later, when you do that, now obviously you took a big chunk out of the portfolio, but I think it's important to think about what it means to relieve withdrawal pressure from a portfolio, because that has behavioral implications, right? If you don't have to look at that portfolio as a source of income as much as you do when there is no other solution in place to produce income, then I think you have a higher probability or a higher likelihood that you will manage that portfolio, and, or with the help of an advisor, will be able to manage that portfolio where if there's some ups and downs, that you'll be better positioned and better able to ride those out. Now, that's looking at this with the scenario where somebody's in very, very good health and they have that lifespan that's going to be stretched out to a pretty lengthy age, pretty older age. Now, if you have somebody who's in relatively poor health, you can have an annuity purchase at age 65 or not. If you do purchase the annuity, you're going to be left with less, at least on a projected basis, but that's really only because you don't have as long of a lifespan that's projected based on that health status. What if that health status is impacted by something that can be addressed by targeted gene therapy, in 10 years? So are you really going to expire when the tables say that you are? And so what if you get out there, in the meantime, you're actually incurring higher annual expenses, right? So there's a lot to think about, and the insured solutions, the annuity solutions can still make sense because they put into place that guaranteed source of income that can help defray some of these other costs and give someone the confidence to be able to manage their portfolio more effectively, which is, of course, the main point. This is really the same thing, except this is showing it with a deferred income annuity. As you're all probably aware, the deferred income annuity under the QLAC, the Qualified Longevity Annuity Contract rule that came out last year, that's a bit easier to implement. There are some tax advantages to that in terms of RMD, and it is a little bit more solid in terms of the guidance, in terms of what can be invested in it. Not this much. I'm showing this putting $295,000 in it. The point being that when you use the deferred income annuity, you have just the one purchase, and it's happening at a fairly significant discount, but it's producing the same income. So if we go back, you'll see at this point, this 36,183. So this was designed, or this was done using real world, real product annuity quotes so that we would produce the same income that would pick up at age 75. Now there's more withdrawal pressure from the portfolio for these first 10 years, but you end up actually in, rather than just under 80,000, you end up with a little over 100,000 left in the portfolio. So that's a function of that deeper discounting that occurs with the deferred income annuity. I think that's it's a tough place for a consumer to get to, to say that I'm going to put this much of a portfolio into a product that's not going to start to pay me for 10 years if I live. The thing is, though, it's a great solution for the problem that you're trying to address, and the problem you're trying to address is generating income. Probably less of a good solution for somebody in poor health, but again, it's a long way between 65 and 80. It's 15 years of medical advances, so what's really going to happen? So I think, though, that it gets very, very hard to implement some of these solutions when you start thinking about different kind of health statuses. So another point that I want to make on all of these illustrations is that I'm showing here what's happening, kind of at the end of this road, and I only took this out to life expectancy. But this is actually inflation-adjusted income that keeps going. So what happens when we get to 87, 88, 89, 95, maybe even 100? Right? That's gone at that point, and that is what's left, versus this that's going to keep growing at 2% a year for as long as this person lives. And I'll mention that this is actually real to me in a very personal way. My wife's grandmother celebrated her 102nd birthday last month. And she is now in assisted living. She has run out of money, and it has become a family collective effort to take care of her. And she went into the hospital in January of this year and was given about 30 days, and she's not really interested in that. She's still, and she calcification. She's got all the things that you would expect someone to have who's over 100 years old. But she's also not a quitter on any level. So, we're all dealing with that. And I think that's the situation so many families are going to be in, right? That they're going to be all dealing with that. Whereas this can go a long way toward helping that not have to be something that families deal with, or at least not at the level. So I mentioned earlier, I mentioned that we have behavioral risks, that we have other risks that come into play when we're relying solely on something like systematic withdrawals to sustain income in retirement. There's also sequence of returns risk. And this is a pretty scary one, I think, and one that doesn't get enough discussion. I think it's getting more now. I read about it more. I think advisors are more in tune to this. I don't know what would happen if we did a consumer study and asked people what sequence of returns risk is. I suspect I know what those results would be, and I don't think we would see a lot of understanding there. But I do think that it's important, because this is potentially the situation a retiree in 2008 faced, right? In 2008, maybe was here, right? And just to back up a moment and talk about what sequence of returns risk actually is, what you're looking at here is the same withdrawals and the same average return over this period of time. What's different about the blue versus the red is that in the blue, there were negative returns that occurred in the first 3 years. I can't remember how I did this, 3 or 4 years, there were negative returns. And on the red, those negative returns occurred in the final 3 years. But the average rate of return is the same across the entire span of time. So that has a very significant effect in terms of the different outcome, right? So in the one case, you had early year positive returns, kept things chugging along while you were taking those withdrawals, and then you got hit with some negative returns later on, but you still have a substantial portfolio left. And when the negative returns occurred here, 2008, 2009, right, then you had that portfolio actually depleted. Now, what else is interesting here is that in my assumptions, I'm assuming that these negative returns occur and then the positive returns occur. But what if the negative returns occur and then returns go to zero or near zero? Because if this represents an individual, then what was left after that devastating loss went to cash in an effort to preserve something. Then none of this happens. And then the withdrawals are coming in, and then maybe you're seeing this go, around here instead of out here. So I think that's both the macro issue that we have to think about. And these so-called black swan events, that occur, they're not so black and they're not so swanish. They tend to happen kind of all the time, right? And I think that's I've actually seen data on this. I apologize, I don't have it with me, but if you think about a normal distribution of returns, right? You have a standard, kind of a bell curve, and you've got within one standard deviation, your returns are maybe fluctuating between, -5 and +5%. Then you have out at the extremes, and so that's supposed to be predictive. And you say, well, at these extremes, we would only see, 3 or 4 of these events over a given period of time, when in actuality we see 15 or 20. So it's those kinds of extreme events that occur with greater frequency than they should occur with statistically. And, that means that if they're occurring with a greater frequency, then how many times is that going to happen over this entire span of time, right? So it's not necessarily just here. It could be here and then again here, right? Or you could be, could be a golden period of time where everything just goes up and up and up. And the point being that you don't know. And if all you're relying on is a projection at 8% or even at 6%, I think, and so I love what I do for IRI because I love producing things that help make this real, right? Help make this scenario that somebody could potentially face real, and show that, even in a low interest rate environment, the mortality credits and the guarantee, obviously the guarantees subject to the ability of the insurance company who writes the annuity to fulfill those guarantees. Keep giving away my ending there. It's so important, It can mean the difference between dignity in retirement and having to go to family, to friends, to what have you, and you don't get a whoopsie or a do-over, right? You've seen your last dollar of earned income maybe 20 years ago. So what if you were wrong about the systematic withdrawal approach? What if your portfolio is gone? Where are you going to find an advisor to help you? You don't have any money. That's when it gets really real, and then there's no other recourse. Whereas if you set it up. So I would also add, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Are we trying to solve for the best internal rate of return among all the investment options we have to choose from? I had an interesting conversation with a financial advisor once. I was talking much the way I'm talking to you now about these things. And she said, well, yeah, the immediate annuity I get, it's guaranteed and it produces the income and so forth. But it's got such a lousy IRR. Well, what are you comparing it to? I said, well, basically anything else. I said, yeah, but you're comparing the IRR of something that is going to happen, right? The internal rate of return of the annuity payments that, as long as the insurance company remains solvent, those payments are going to happen. So you're looking at internal rate of return based on that. And you're comparing that to the internal rate of return of something that might happen based on historical returns for those asset classes you're looking at. So what are you trying to solve for? Are you trying to solve for making sure this individual has enough income to last the rest of their life, no matter how long that life is? Or are you trying to win among all the investment options you have to choose from? She was going to win anyway, right? And I say that being a little bit flip, but the fact of the matter is, a portfolio is going to get constructed, and it's going to incorporate different asset classes and different types of solutions to achieve something. And whether it does it or not, she's not the one that has to worry about that. So that's why we spend so much time trying to educate about these. So here's just some thoughts on everything I've talked about today. It really, truly is, I think, a balancing act, right? You have income needs. You have investable, at least in my example, I understand that not everybody has investable assets on the level that I looked at this. It was purely arbitrary and just really illustrated, done to make a point. But you have to think about how you're going to use those assets. And your health status, your income needs, it all goes in the mix. And so you do have to balance these. And, I would never advocate that somebody take $1 million and plop it into an immediate annuity, right? You don't do that. You have to meet different needs, and you have to have, more of a bucketed approach. But I really, truly believe that guaranteed income should be part of that. You have to think about the opportunity cost of this product versus that product. You have to think about all these things. So it is challenging, right? But it is also solvable, I think. The product mix. There's a level of assets, of course there's a level of assets where an annuity isn't necessary. I don't know what that level is. Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? Is it $1.5 million? What is wealth anyway? It's all relative. What do your expenses look like, right? So if you live in one of these micro houses that I love these shows about these people that are moving into these little trailers, they're actually really fun. I can't wait to see the Year Later show when that couple who moved into that little thing, because I suspect they're going to be at the throats. But there are many ways that you can control, you can do things, more on the expense side, and you can kind of change that mix. The trick is finding that balance and understanding what that client, it wants to do. And here's my daring stuff, right? So what does all this mean for products we might see developed? Well, why can't some of these income payments that come out of these products, is there a way to tie those income payments to medical expenses? Or failing that, is there some type of combination? Somebody who buys an immediate annuity is in better health, right? So can that translate over into maybe a better premium scenario on a medical product? I don't know the answer to that. I'm kind of throwing that out as an idea because I see those kind of combinations happening. They're happening with long-term care and variable annuities, for example. So could they extend more out there? So finally, who knows who that is? Does anybody know who that is?
Your grandmother.
Yes, it is. It's not my wife's grandmother. But that is Harriet Thompson. She just became the oldest woman to complete a marathon in San Diego on May 31st. And I put her up here not only as an example of what advancing years can look like and how different it could be for different people, but also because she's a 3-time cancer survivor on top of being that marathon winner. And she didn't start running until she was 76. So many things can change over a long retirement. And I don't know what her medical expenses look like. I don't know what her income picture looks like. I know she ran that marathon in 7 hours and a little bit of change. That's not too bad for age 92. And by the way, that's her son behind her. He's 56. He's probably thinking about his retirement and how he's going to do it. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.